Somewhere in the dark, something is still running. Not loudly, not in the dramatic way of a crisis that demands your immediate attention. More like the way a lamp left on in a distant room sends a thin thread of light under the door. Present, quiet, and just enough to remind you it has not been turned off. You may know exactly what that lamp is, the conversation you did not quite finish, the decision that has no clear answer, no matter how many angles you approach it from, the version of your life that feels like it is waiting for you to figure something out before it can continue. Or perhaps you don't know exactly what it is. Perhaps it is simply a quality, a texture to the dark that is different tonight from the dark of a night when nothing is unresolved. Either way, you are not alone in this. Right now, in this same darkness, in time zones you will never visit, there are people lying exactly as you are lying. Not in anguish, not in crisis, simply in the specific and very human condition of being alive in the middle of a life that has not finished revealing itself. Before we begin, I want to ask you something small. If you feel like it, leave one word in the comments tonight. Just one word for what you are carrying into this dark. Waiting, unfinished, suspended, open. Whatever word is honest for you right now. No explanation needed, just the word. If these stories find you well, the subscribe button is just there. It costs nothing, and it means this kind of night will find you again when you need it. Now, close your eyes, if they are ready. Tonight's stories come from 5 centuries and 6 traditions that rarely appear together in the Western world. A Burmese farmer who sat with his doubt every morning for 60 years beside a river that didn't know his name. An 11th century Tibetan woman who built something in the mountains and watched it burn, and built again. A Japanese monk who made ink paintings in silence and destroyed every one of them before dawn. A Sri Lankan queen who gave everything she had and died not knowing if it had been enough. A Chinese wanderer who stopped in the middle of a road and could not remember where he was going, and in that forgetting, found the one thing he had been walking toward his entire life. And a Korean hermit who sat alone for so long that the mountain stopped feeling like an obstacle and began to feel like company. These stories are contemplative in nature. They are offered here as a place to breathe, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Simply stories. Simply this. Feel where your body meets whatever is beneath it right now. Not trying to make the meeting more comfortable than it is. Just noticing the pressure, the specific weight of this moment, the ceiling somewhere above you, the particular quality of the dark in this room at this hour. You made it to tonight. Whatever this day asked of you, it has asked its last for now. The stories are waiting. The Irrawaddy River moves south. It has always moved south. It will be moving south long after the last person who remembers sitting beside it has dissolved back into the earth that lines its banks. In the stretch of river that passes through the Sagoing region of central Burma, what is now Myanmar, the current in the dry season runs with a slowness that is almost indistinguishable from stillness. The surface of the water in the late afternoon catches the light in a way that the people who have lived beside it for generations have tried, with mixed results, to describe to people who have not. Not like silver, not exactly, more like the memory of light. An old man named U Sain Myint had been watching this particular stretch of the river for 61 years when this story finds him. He was 83 years old. He had planted and harvested rice on the 3 acres of paddy land his father had worked before him, and his grandfather before that. He had been a lay Buddhist practitioner since the age of 8. He had sat with his breath most mornings since. Not every morning. There had been years in which the sitting was irregular, shortened by the demands of planting season, or broken entirely by grief. But most mornings, in the hour before the work of the day began, he had sat on the wooden platform outside the house that faced east, watching the light develop over the river while his breath moved. He was not enlightened. He did not experience himself as enlightened. This was the fact about U Sein Ment's practice that he held most honestly. After 61 years of sitting, he was not visibly different from the man he would have been without the sitting, except in ways so subtle and so interior that he could not point to them and say, "Here, this is what the practice gave me." He still worried. He still felt the familiar tightening of the chest when the rains were late. He still felt the ambient, particular grief of missing his wife, the way a room feels different when a piece of furniture that has always been there is suddenly absent. What the practice had given him was not freedom from these things. It had given him something harder to name. A quality of being fully inside a difficult feeling without believing that the feeling was the whole of what was happening. The way you can be fully inside a monsoon rain and also be aware that the rain is passing through a sky that the rain does not own. He could not tell you when this had arrived. It had not arrived. It had accumulated, the way silt accumulates on the banks of the Irrawaddy, invisibly, continuously, deposited by the same water that also carries it away. On the morning this story is about, he rose before the light came and sat on the platform in the dark. The river was not visible yet, but he could hear it, the particular low, continuous sound of moving water at distance. A sound so constant that he only noticed it when he specifically turned his attention toward it. He was not trying to do anything this morning. This was the thing about 61 years of practice. The trying had, over decades, gradually and almost entirely dissolved. Not because he had achieved some state beyond trying, but because the trying had simply worn itself out. The way a new pair of sandals wears itself smooth against the road until the friction is gone. He sat. The dark held him. The river moved. A thought arrived, whether the second paddy field would need attention before the next planting season. He noticed the thought. He did not push it away. He also did not follow it. It moved through. Another thought. His youngest daughter, who lived 2 hours south by bus, and whom he had not seen since the festival at the end of last year. Her face as a child. Her face now. This thought had more weight. He let it have its weight. He did not attempt to resolve anything it was attached to, because there was nothing to resolve. She was there. He was here. The distance was what it was. The love was also what it was. The thought moved through. The light began at the horizon. First, a suggestion, a quality in the dark that was less dark than the dark around it, as though the air itself remembered what light felt like and was beginning, tentatively, to demonstrate. Then, color. The specific pale gold of the Burmese dry season dawn, thin and very clean, arriving without announcement over the flat eastern horizon beyond the river. The river appeared, brown and wide and moving south as it always had. U Sein Ment looked at it. He had looked at this river 10,000 times. He would look at it. He understood this without any particular drama, perhaps a few hundred more times before he did not. And in the looking, this morning, as on many mornings over many decades, he noticed something that he had never been able to adequately explain to anyone who asked him about his practice. The river did not know his name. It did not know that he had farmed beside it for 60 years. It carried all of this, the reflections of all of it, moving south through its current, without holding any of it, and it would continue moving south when there was no one left to watch. This had once frightened him. It no longer did. Not because he had found an answer to what it meant. He had not found an answer. He had instead, across 60 years of watching, arrived at a place where the question had stopped requiring an answer in order for him to sit comfortably beside it. The river moves south. The light grows. He is here, and for now, that is the whole fact, and the whole fact is enough. This is the teaching that Usain Mind's river offers on a night like this one. Not that the uncertainty will resolve, not that the unfinished thing will finish on a schedule that makes rest possible, but that the awareness in which uncertainty arises, the quiet, consistent, unbothered awareness that has been watching the river of your thoughts move through all these years, is itself not uncertain, is itself not unfinished. The river is still moving. You are still here. Let your shoulders release now, just slightly, just enough to feel the difference between holding and not holding. Gravity knows what to do with what you have been carrying. Let it do that work. And as the Irrawaddy moves south through the dark without asking anything of you, we travel now from the river plains of Burma northward and westward across the centuries to the high plateau of Tibet, where a woman built something in the mountains that she knew, even as she built it, would not last, and discovered that this knowledge was not the obstacle she had believed it to be. In the central Tibetan province of Yu, in the 11th century of the Common Era, there was a tradition among certain practitioners of the Kagyu lineage of building meditation hermitages in places that were, by any ordinary measure, poorly chosen for building. Not poorly chosen in the sense of lacking beauty. The sites were often extraordinarily beautiful, ridge lines above the tree line, where the light at dawn had the particular quality of high-altitude clarity. River gorges, where the sound of water carried upward through the rock in a low, continuous register that became, after enough time, indistinguishable from the sound of one's own breathing. Poorly chosen in the sense of being difficult to reach, difficult to maintain, exposed to weather that came without announcement and left without ceremony. This was not an accident. The teachers of the Kagyu tradition who established these sites understood something about the relationship between impermanence and practice that is very difficult to understand in the abstract. But that becomes, slowly and inescapably, clear when you build your home in a place that makes no promises about how long it will stand. A woman named Machik Drolma, the texts record her name as the liberating moon, had understood this more directly than most. She had been born in the valley of Shelkar in the western Tibetan region of Sang in approximately the year 1042. Her childhood had been shaped by movement, by the specific impermanence of a life organized around the route rather than the destination. By her mid-20s, she had received transmissions from 3 senior practitioners of the Kagyu lineage. She had been recognized by her teachers as having a quality of practice stability that was unusual for a student of her level and age. Not the dramatic stability of the person who never encounters difficulty, but the quieter stability of someone who encounters difficulty consistently and has learned, through consistent practice, not to be entirely surprised by it. At 31, she chose her site. It was a ridge above the Nyemo Valley, at an altitude where the ground was permafrost from the late autumn through the early summer. The wind from the northwest came directly off the plateau, without any geography to interrupt it. The nearest source of water was a spring 300 meters below, along a path that was navigable in dry weather and became, in the monsoon months, a chute of moving mud that required both hands and considerable nerve. She built alone, largely. It took 1 full year. When it was finished, it was a single room, approximately 4 meters by 4 meters, walls of rough stone, a low door facing east, a single window, a raised clay platform for sleeping and sitting, a small clay hearth with a smoke hole in the roof. She moved in before the structure was fully dry. The first winter was the coldest of her adult life. The walls held the cold, the way stone holds cold, not as a visiting condition, but as a resident one. The water in the wooden bowl froze each night. The path to the spring was unusable from the first snow until the ground softened the following spring. She had planned for this by storing enough in clay containers to last the months of inaccessibility, rationing with the precision of someone who has calculated the gap between available supply and minimum requirement, and found it sufficient only if nothing is wasted. She sat, she recited, she performed the visualization practices her teachers had transmitted. She slept when the body required it. She rose before dawn and began again. The hermitage stood for 11 years. Then, in the spring of the year of the water dragon, a fire began in the valley below and moved upward through the dry grass of the lower ridge before the wind shifted. By the time it reached the structure, there was nothing to be done. She stood on the upper slope above the hermitage and watched it burn. With the specific quality of attention that her 11 years of practice had given her, not detachment, not the performance of equanimity, simply watching, fully present to the burning, not requiring the burning to be otherwise. The texts record that she remained on that ridge for 3 days. Then she came down from the mountain, accepted food and a place to sleep, and after a week of rest, began selecting stones for the new site. The second hermitage stood for 19 years before a landslide took it. She built again. In her final months, a student asked her why she had rebuilt after the fire and after the landslide, instead of finding a more stable site. Machik Drolma was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "A hermitage that could not burn would teach me nothing about fire. A practice built on permanence is not practice, it is decoration." The student considered this. Then she said, "But doesn't the burning take something from you each time?" The teacher looked at her. The morning light came through the window with the particular quality of high-altitude winter light, thin, very clear, with a precision that lower altitudes never quite achieve. "Yes," she said, "and what it takes is what I needed to release." This is not a story about not caring. Machik Drolma cared about her hermitage. She had built it with her hands. The burning was a real loss. What the burning revealed, and what the rebuilding demonstrated, was that what she had been building, across all 3 hermitages, was not a structure that would last. She had been building a practice of continuing, a capacity for beginning again that was not dependent on the conditions being favorable, on the previous effort having been preserved, on the outcome of the previous attempt having been confirmed before the next one could begin. Feel your jaw soften now. Let the muscles around the eyes release. The ceiling is above you, and the floor is below you, and between them you are held, exactly as you are, in a structure that needs nothing from you tonight except your presence inside it. And as the smoke from Machik Drolma's hermitage dissolves back into the Tibetan sky from which it came, we travel now eastward and forward 3 centuries, to the forests of Song Dynasty China, where a monk who had practiced for 40 years arrived at a gate he had never been through, and discovered it had been standing open all along. In the forests of the Tianmu Mountains, in what is now Zhejiang province of China, in the late years of the southern Song dynasty, there was a monastery called Lingyin Si, the Temple of the Soul's Retreat. It had been a monastery since the 4th century. By the time this story takes place, it had been burned and rebuilt, expanded and reduced by flood and politics. It occupied a narrow valley at the base of a cliff of porous limestone, whose surface was pitted with caves that had been carved into small meditation cells barely large enough to sit in. The sound in that valley was specific: water, from the 2 streams that converged near the monastery's gate, and wind through the bamboo groves on the lower slopes, and the percussion of the morning bell that the monks had been ringing at the same hour every morning since before any living person in the valley could remember. A monk named Chen Mingji had been at Lingyin for 43 years when this story finds him. He had arrived at 21 from a merchant family in coastal Hangzhou. He had walked away from the life being assembled around him on a spring morning, having decided, with the clarity that sometimes comes to young people who have been thinking about something steadily for a long time, that the life being assembled around him was not the life he was trying to live. He had practiced, he had studied, he had sat under 3 successive abbots. He was, at 64, a senior monk, not the abbot. He had been offered this and declined twice. But he was the person that younger monks came to when something in their practice had become stuck. On the morning this story is about, he was doing something very ordinary. He was sweeping the stone path between the meditation hall and the kitchen. He had been sweeping this path for 43 years. The broom was worn to a shape that exactly matched the motion of his arm. The path stones were familiar to him, through the feet, through the specific unevenness of each stone, through the places where the grout between them had been repaired and where it had not. He was sweeping. The morning air smelled of pine resin and cold stone, and the breakfast fire beginning in the kitchen ahead of him. A young monk named Wei Zhen passed him on the path, heading toward the meditation hall. He was 23, newly arrived from a mountain monastery in the north. He had the slightly haggard quality of a person who has been trying extremely hard for a long time without arriving anywhere. He stopped when he reached Chen Mingji. He said, "Senior monk, I have been sitting for 3 years and I am not making progress. How do I make progress?" Chen Mingji continued sweeping for a moment. Then he stopped. He looked at the young monk. He said, "What does the path look like to you right now?" Wei Jin gestured at the stone path beneath them. "The same as always." "And what does it look like to me?" The young monk paused. "The same, I suppose." Chen Mingji looked down at the path for a long moment. "I have been sweeping this path for 43 years, he said. "When I first arrived, I thought the sweeping was something I did between practice and practice. I thought the real work was in the hall, in the sitting, in the periods of formal meditation. The sweeping was maintenance, preparation, the instrumental activity that supported the real activity." He paused. "When did you stop thinking that?" Wei Zhen asked. "I am not sure I have entirely stopped," Chen Mingji said. "But I notice something now that I did not notice for many years. The broom in my hand, the resistance of the grit and the pine needles against the bristles, the specific cold of the morning air against my face. These things are fully present. They do not require me to get somewhere else in order to be here." He looked at the young monk. "What you are searching for does not live at the end of the path. It is not waiting for you to make enough progress to deserve it. It is present in the moment when the broom meets the stone, in the moment when the cold air meets the face, in the moment when a young monk asks a question and an old monk stops and actually considers it." Wei Zhen was quiet. "This is it," he said finally. "This is it." The young monk looked around, at the path, the stones, the kitchen door, the pine trees on the slope above the meditation hall. "But I have been here the whole time," he said. "I have been on this path 1,000 times." "Yes," Chen Mingji said. He picked up the broom and continued sweeping. "Most of us are. Let your hands soften now. Let the palms open slightly against whatever they are resting on. The path does not need to be swept tonight. The broom can wait until morning." And as the stone path at Lingyin Sea disappears into the fog that comes down from the mountain each evening, we travel southward and forward in time, to the island of Sri Lanka, where a queen gave away what she could not keep, and discovered that the giving itself had always been the point. In the royal city of Anuradhapura, in the ancient Sinhala kingdom of Lanka, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, there was a queen named Anula. She gave, not dramatically, not in the way of a sovereign making calculations about the public relations value of visible generosity. She gave the way people give, when giving has become so habitual that it no longer feels like a decision, when the hand extends toward whoever needs something before the mind has had time to calculate the cost. She established 3 feeding halls in Anuradhapura, where anyone, monk, wanderer, farmer, displaced by flood, merchant fallen on hard years, could eat without payment or obligation. The chroniclers record that on festival days, the lines extended beyond the city gates. She built roads connecting the capital to the mountain monasteries. She funded the maintenance of the great irrigation tanks. She visited the monasteries not as a patron expecting acknowledgement, but as a practitioner seeking teaching. The question she carried was not unusual. It was the same question that has driven practitioners into halls and mountains and rivers and caves across every tradition in every century. How do I live in a way that, at the end, I will be able to look at with honesty and say, this was what I was for? And then the resources diminished. It happened the way such things happen. A sequence of poor harvests, a tributary kingdom that stopped sending its revenues, the accumulated expense of decades of generosity that had not been calculating its own sustainability as carefully as it had been calculating the needs of those it served. She continued giving, less lavishly. The feeding halls remained open, but the menus simplified. The monastery visits continued, though the offerings she brought were thinner. She noticed that the monks received the reduced offerings with exactly the same gratitude they had shown the abundant ones. This told her something about the monks, and something about what the giving had always been. A senior monk named Ravata visited her in her later years, when her health was declining in a way that made clear to everyone in the household that the decline was not temporary. He sat with her in the afternoon light. He asked, "What is the feeling in the mind today?" She said, "Not certain. I have given what I had. I don't know if it was enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is the mind clinging to that question right now?" She considered this, not as an abstract inquiry, but as a real examination of what was actually happening inside her at this moment. The afternoon light, the sound of the courtyard fountain, the specific ache of joints that had been carrying a body for 60-some years. "Yes," she said, "I think it is." "Then that is where to rest," he said, "not in the question, in the awareness that is watching the question." She closed her eyes. She felt the warmth of the afternoon light through the window on her face. She felt the weight of the chair beneath her. She felt the breath moving, still moving, after everything, still simply moving. And in that moment, she understood something she had not been able to understand while the giving had been abundant and the resources had felt limitless. The giving had not been a means to an outcome. Each feeding hall, each road, each morning visit to a monastery, each of these had been complete in itself, finished in the moment of its giving, not requiring any further confirmation to have been real. She had given enough. She had always been giving enough. The river does not ask whether the fields it waters will produce a good harvest before it agrees to flow. You have given enough today. Not because everything you gave was perfectly given, but because giving is what the practice is. The hands have been open. Let them stay open now. Let your arms soften. Let the elbows unlock slightly. Let the whole weight of the arms rest where they rest, heavy and quiet, and through with their work for tonight. And as the Queen's courtyard fills with evening light, we travel northward and eastward, across the centuries, to a Japanese monk who stood at the edge of something vast and chose, very quietly, to step into it. On the eastern slope of the Higashiyama Hills in the ancient capital of Kyoto, in the late years of the Muromachi period, sometime in the early 15th century, there was a small Rinzai Zen monastery called Ryokan-in, whose name translated, approximately, as the place where good remains. It had no famous garden, no historically significant artifact, no lineage that produced masters whose names appear in the standard accounts. It had a monk named Teshu, who made ink paintings. Teshu had been painting since he was a young novice, and he had developed, over 3 decades of practice, a quality of execution that the abbot of the larger monastery at Tofukuji described with a careful brevity that was more eloquent than praise. The brush does not lie. He was not producing art for display. He was using the brush, the way his practice used the breath, as a means of investigation, of learning to be fully present to the moment of execution without the ego's constant interference. And every morning, before the community woke for the first bell, he burned everything he had painted the night before. A young monk from Tofukuji, sent to Ryokan-in for a season of training, happened to observe the burning one morning. He had woken before the bell and stood at the edge of the small courtyard, watching Teshu feed painting after painting into the small fire pit near the north wall. The paintings, even in the firelight, were extraordinary. Mountains, in a few strokes, that contained all the weight and indifference of mountains. Water suggested by the white of the paper between 2 marks. A single crow on a branch that managed, in the economy of its execution, to hold every quality the tradition associated with winter solitude. All of it, into the fire. When Teshu noticed the young monk standing at the edge of the courtyard, he simply finished feeding the last painting to the fire and waited. "Why?" the young monk asked. "If I keep them," Teshu said, "I begin to compare last night's mountain against this morning's mountain. The comparison takes me out of the stroke." "But they are extraordinary," the young monk said. "Some of them are good, yes. But a good painting held on to becomes a reason to paint less freely tomorrow. It becomes the standard. The standard becomes a cage." He picked up the empty wooden tray. "The painting is finished when the brush lifts. What I do with it after that is not painting. It is something else. Pride, or vanity, or the fear that tomorrow's work will be lesser. None of those are reasons to keep a painting." The young monk considered this for a long time. "Do you ever regret burning them?" Teshu was quiet for a moment. The fire was dying down. "Every morning," he said. "And every morning I burn them anyway. Because the regret is what teaches me that I was attached, and the burning is what reminds me that the painting was never the point." He went inside. The painting had been real. The burning had been real, and in between them, in the moment when the brush met the paper and the painter was fully there, not thinking about yesterday's painting or tomorrow's, something happened that the ash did not contain and the fire could not erase. That something is available to you tonight. Not the painting, the moment of the brush meeting the paper, the moment that is always complete in itself, always sufficient, always real. This breath is that moment. Let your eyes rest now, behind closed lids. Let the forehead smooth, the small muscles above the eyes softening. Nothing to compare, nothing to measure against what was. The stroke is done. The next one has not begun. Just this, in the space between them. And as the ash from Teshu's fire lifts in the morning air over the Higashiyama Hills, we move now to the Korean coast, where an old teacher walked into the sea and taught his final lesson in the walking. On the southern coast of Korea, in the Joseon dynasty period, sometime in the early 16th century, there was a master of the Seon tradition named Muhak Jacho, whose name meant something close to the one who has nothing to learn. This was not a statement of pride. It was a description of a quality of mind, the openness that results when there is no longer anything to add. He had been a teacher for 30 years at a small mountain monastery above the city of Tongyong, on the curved southern coast, where the sea came into the land in a complicated geography of islands and bays and narrow passages. He was known for teaching by not teaching, for meeting students who arrived with elaborate questions about the nature of mind and responding with something so ordinary that the student often left more confused than they had arrived, only to return weeks or months later, having sat with the ordinary thing long enough for it to open. He was 81 years old when he gathered his students for what he called simply a morning walk. He said nothing to indicate this would be different from the walks they had taken before. He said nothing to indicate it was the last. They walked from the monastery down through the cedar forest to the fishing village on the coast, a walk of perhaps 3 hours along a path that descended through several changes in vegetation. From the high forest with its cold resinous air, into the warmer bamboo groves of the middle slope, and finally into the salt smell of the coastal zone, where the light had a quality particular to proximity to water. They arrived at the beach in the morning light. The sea was calm that morning, the particular calm of the southern Korean coast in late autumn, when the typhoon season has passed and the winter storms have not yet begun. The water had a surface quality of absolute stillness that made it look less like water and more like blue glass held in the curve of the bay. Muhak walked to the water's edge. He stood there for a moment. Then he waded in. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. He waded in the way a person wades into water that is cold and familiar, with the careful, deliberate step of someone who has done this before. He kept walking. When the water reached his waist, one of his students called out, "Teacher, where are you going?" Muhak kept walking. He said, without turning, "I don't know." The students stood at the water's edge. Some started to follow. Others held back. There was a quality to his movement, the deliberateness of it, the absence of anxiety in it, that made them uncertain whether intervention was called for or whether this was the teaching they had been failing to receive for 30 years. When the water reached his chest, he stopped. He stood there for a long moment. The sea was still. The morning light came off the water and touched his face. He turned, just slightly, so that his students could see his profile against the sea. "You have been following me for many years," he said. His voice carried clearly across the water. "Following me is a way of not finding what you are looking for. What you are looking for does not live in the direction I am walking." He paused. "It lives in the direction your own feet are already standing." He waded back to shore. He stepped out of the water. He was soaking wet, and he was 81 years old, and he was smiling, with the particular smile of someone who has just demonstrated something that cannot be fully explained, and knows it. He walked back up the path to the monastery without speaking further. He died 3 months later, on an ordinary winter morning, in his own room, sitting in the posture he had maintained for 30 years. His students found him in the early light, still in that posture, and none of them could determine precisely when the sitting had shifted from practice to something else, which was, they decided eventually, exactly what he had intended. The teaching from the southern coast is this: you do not need to follow anyone into the sea. The thing you are looking for is not out there, in the direction of some further effort, some greater understanding, some state of affairs different from the one you are in. It is where your feet are already standing. Feel them now. Feel the pressure of them against whatever surface is beneath you, the weight of the whole body, resting into the surface, not fighting the resting, not waiting for the resting to become something better. Just this, just the breath, just the body, held in this particular dark. We have traveled a long way tonight, to the river in Burma, where an old farmer watched the water move south and understood that the watching was all that had ever been required. To the Tibetan ridge, where a woman built twice in the knowledge of burning and found that the knowledge made the building truer. To the forest monastery in China, where a monk swept a path for 43 years and found, in the sweeping of it, everything the sitting had been preparing him to find. To the Lankan court, where a queen who gave everything understood in her last afternoon that the giving had always been complete in itself. To the morning fire in Kyoto, where a painter burned every painting and discovered that the brush meeting the paper was the only part that could not be taken. And to the southern sea, where an old teacher waded in and turned and said, "What you are looking for lives in the direction your own feet are already standing." 6 traditions, 6 centuries, 6 different forms of the same recognition. That the uncertainty you are carrying tonight does not need to resolve in order for you to rest. That the unfinished thing does not need to be finished in order for this moment to be complete. Let the names dissolve now. Let the stories return to the silence they came from. The Burmese river, the Tibetan ridge, the Chinese path, the Lankan afternoon, the Kyoto fire, the Korean sea. Let them go. What remains when the stories dissolve is what was always here. The breath moving, the body held. The darkness, which is simply darkness, not a problem to be solved, not a condition to be escaped, just the particular quality of this hour in this room as it actually is. The sea does not explain itself to anyone who stands at its edge. It is simply there, moving, vast, utterly indifferent to whether you understand it. And you can stand at its edge tonight and feel the water, the breath, moving past your feet, without needing to know where it comes from or where it goes. Just the movement. Just this. If sleep is reaching for you now, let it come. You do not need to stay awake for these stories. They will find you wherever you are. Let the breath do what the river does. Move south, in the only direction it has ever moved, carrying you through this night toward whatever the morning will bring. Not because you have figured anything out, not because the uncertainty has lifted, but because you are here and the river is moving, and that has always been enough. I want to say something before you go. I make this channel because I believe, genuinely, that the wisdom in these stories belongs to everyone, not to scholars, not to monastics, to you, in whatever room you are lying in tonight, with whatever it is you are carrying. If these stories found something in you tonight, if they gave you one breath that went a little deeper, one moment that felt a little less alone, I am genuinely glad. Leave a comment if you feel like it. Tell me where in the world you are, and one word for what you brought into this dark tonight. Someone will read it. Someone will feel less alone for having seen it. And if this channel is something you want to keep finding, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means the next time you need a night like this one, it will be waiting. Sleep well. The river is still moving. The shore is right where it always was. Good night.